to everyone. We warmly welcome to our first Technical Inclusive Green Finance Working Group webinar. To begin, I would like to run through the housekeeping matters. First, just to be sure that everyone is aware about how to undertake a webinar today. Could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. Warm greeting to all participants. Welcome to our second IGF webinar series on Introduction to Inclusive Green Finance and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Laura Ramos. I'm the Inclusive Green Finance Working Group Manager at AFI, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator today. Please let me welcome Walid. Let me go through the agenda. So we will review these topics, the opening remarks from Walid Ali, the IGF Working Group Chair from Central Bank of Egypt. Then we'll go to the first part, that is the introduction to the inclusive green finance. Then we will move on to the sustainable development goals, and then we open the floor for the questions. So let me welcome Walid. Thank you, Walid.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's my pleasure to meet with you all again, our second webinar. I'd like to thank all the members who joined us today and their attendance, and to welcome all the panelists and all AFI management team who are working really hard to make things happen in those circumstances. And to looking forward for the Inclusive Green Finance Working Group technical webinar and all the informations that we will receive today for your respective presentation. Thank you very much. Have a good session. Thank you. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Walid. So let me introduce our technical experts. Johanna Nyman, that everybody knows her, and she doesn't need any presentation. She is the head of Inclusive Green Finance at Alliance for Financial Inclusion. And let me introduce you our special panelist, that is Mark Halle. Mark Halle is a senior advisor to the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability. Mark has made a career in sustainable development policy. Before retiring in 2016, he was an executive director of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He served as a leading advisor to the UNEP Inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system, with a special focus on developing countries. The inquiry sought to identify the reforms needed to the rules governing financial and capital markets to align them better with the needs of the real economy and sustainable development. Outside of sustainable finance, Mark is chair of the board of Traffic International and is a co-founder of a new initiative on nature and conservation called Better Nature. Mark has Swiss, American, and Italian citizenship. Thank you very much. And let me welcome Johanna. I give you the floor for you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura, and a really great pleasure to be here with so many of the members in the Inclusive Green Finance Working Group joining us for this second webinar. I understand that these are quite challenging times for all of us, and I really appreciate that you take this time to join us, even if it's not in person, it's over this Zoom meeting. And I'm really happy that we can progress and still discuss policy solutions and regulation for inclusive green finance together. So during this webinar, I will be covering climate change impacts, climate change related risk, inclusive green finance, and then the 4P framework with promotion, provision, protection, and prevention policies. We will very shortly touch on national strategies, and then look and refinancing for recovery and reconstruction in Bangladesh Bank, Nepal Rastra Bank, but also for recovery and reconstruction we see both in Peru and in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Then we move on, and in the provision policies, we also see an example of innovation investment fund, which Bank Al Maghrib has been a part of creating to support startups in the field ranging from fintech to renewable energy. And this includes clean tech, so it's a green purpose. But also we see other financing schemes, for example, in the Seychelles, aimed at MSMEs for energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. The challenges with provision policies, they signal a clear commitment to climate action. They are quite challenging to monitor. Challenges include how the beneficiaries are defined, what constitutes renewable or green products as discussed, and how does one distinguish between adaptation to climate change and general economic development? How can greenwashing be avoided? And also how to identify the resources for financing of these provision policies. The third policy bucket is the protection policy, and I would say this is maybe the most concrete one when we think about individuals and MSMEs and how to build their resilience to climate change. And protection policies, they reduce financial risk by socializing potential losses through insurance, credit guarantees, social payments, or any other related risk-sharing mechanisms. And here, climate risk insurance, we're going to have an entire webinar, I think the next one dedicated to climate risk insurance, and the Access to Insurance Initiative will share more information about this. We also have a subgroup in the working group, the protection subgroup, working on a specific case study on the work that the Central Bank of Armenia has been doing with regards to rolling out Agriculture's Insurance National Agency and climate risk insurance for small-scale for farmers in Armenia. We also see credit guarantees. We have here two examples from Nigeria and from the Bank of Ghana. The Nigeria incentive-based risk-sharing system for agricultural lending. I believe this is a quite interesting policy initiative, and it would be quite interesting to look more into these ones also more in detail to see how they are function and how they are built to understand these better. The last part of this category is related to post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. One of them is early withdrawal from pension funds to enable people to rebuild after disasters, and the second one is direct payment, government-to-person payments after a disaster. Then the challenges with protection policies. As in any situation where risk is only partially borne by a decision maker, risk sharing will have consequences. Some of these are welcome, for example, having insurance in a greater incentive for farmers to make productive agricultural investment than receiving cash grants. But others effects may not be so desirable, such as beneficiaries engaging in more risk-prone behavior. So that's, of course, a weighting that needs to be added. The very last category is prevention policies. And I would say they are more actually connected to the provision policies. And this is about environmental and social risk management guidelines. And these policies aim to avoid undesirable outcomes by lowering financial, social, and environmental risks. And these are a couple of AFI members that put in place ESRM, Environmental and Social, or ERM, Environmental Risk Management Guidelines. And this is to proactively assess and address the social and environmental externalities and risks of their institutions' activities, including the unintended consequences of financing certain projects or certain activities. I think this is an area we haven't looked that much into yet, and we do not have a subgroup working on this. But there are quite some interesting opportunities related to ESRM guidelines, for example, taking into account carbon dioxide emissions or adaptive capacity. But of course, also ESRM guidelines run the risk of potentially leading not to financial inclusion, but financial exclusion. And that's, of course, something we want to avoid. So I believe this is also an area that could be discussed more in detail. Very quickly, these are the 4 Ps. The different policies. I hope that I shared some new ones to you as well. And these are going to be published in the new version of the landscape that is coming out in June. Any comments on all of this is, of course, more than welcome. You as members in the working group are the owners of this knowledge. Any contributions or even critical comments, of course, feel free to share. Very towards the end, just to reflect that all these policies have been encapsulated in different forms of national strategies. And I would say there are three different categories: explicitly integrated climate change into national financial inclusion strategies, or implicitly doing so. But also we see an increasing number of AFI members who put in place other financial sector strategies that are linking financial inclusion and climate change. One of the most recent being the Bank of Ghana launching the Sustainable Banking Principles for Ghana, I think in November last year. But also, for example, in Jordan, having a microfinance action plan that is very much also focusing on renewable energy. So these are a couple of the versions of how to integrate IGF into a national level strategy. And we also have a subgroup in the FISPLIC, the Financial Inclusion Strategies Peer Learning Group, that is looking into how to integrate IGF into a national financial inclusion strategy. Having said that, this is definitely an area that I would love to talk more about. This is maybe not for this webinar, but this is something I think would be interesting to look into. But moving forward in terms of trends and challenges that we see, something I mentioned quite a number of times is the definitions. What is green? How to classify? That is quite important, and I think something that is emerging across the globe in different settings. There's a big question amongst you, either to incentivize or to penalize green projects, or to penalize brown projects or environmentally harmful projects. There's quite a lot of potential for MSMEs and the green economy. We just compiled a report on MSMEs and IGF, which brings together examples of green financing and resilience building for MSMEs. And I believe that this is an area there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of discussions globally about fintech to accelerate IGF, digital financial services, and how they can be linked to IGF. And also there's discussions about how to build in specific gender considerations into inclusive green finance. We know that women are very hardly hit by climate change, disproportionately affected. Are there specific regulatory or policy responses that can alleviate this burden they are having from climate change? Then, of course, the last one, I'm putting it in as a tail here because this is not the focus of our webinar, but we cannot today talk about, I think, any policy area without acknowledging the reality we're seeing happening around us. COVID-19, a global pandemic, resulting in destruction, loss of life and loss of livelihoods, having a devastating impact on a number of economies, especially the most vulnerable, as well as MSMEs. My question, I'm not going to answer it, but my question to you as well is, how can the recovery be green? In the short term, the green perspectives cannot maybe be that strong. This is about survival. But in the long term, how can there be green or inclusive green finance elements built into the recovery plans following this global pandemic? I believe this is something important to discuss. And of course, if you have a perspective on this, I would be very happy to listen. But this, dear IGF Working Group, concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A box right now, or to ask it in the Q&A session afterwards. With this, it's a very great pleasure to be able to give over to Mark Halle, who will be sharing a very interesting presentation with us. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to joining us in this webinar. Your presence is really much appreciated. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you can hear me. I'm not sure you can yet see me, but that may be not a problem. Let me just go straight into the presentation. But let me introduce it by saying that I and my colleagues in the UNEP Inquiry have been great admirers of AFI over the years. We think you've done simply fantastic work, and the presentation you just gave, Johanna, is a real illustration of it. So before we leave this slide, let me just say a few things in introduction. I think there's a fair amount of overlap, certainly in vision and mission between what you're doing and what we have been doing from the UN Environment Programme's perspective. We we want to insist from the start that when we talk about sustainable finance, we are not talking simply about the environmental element of it, but also the social one. And sustainable development has the three legs to the stool: the social, the environmental, and the economic, and clearly they're all very important. So when we talk about sustainable finance, don't think that we are simply talking about the environment. The second is that we are very impressed with your use of inclusive green finance, because it in a phrase encapsulates that double mission: one to save the planet, and the other to save humanity, so to speak. And particularly like the inclusive notion in talking about the social side, because what we believe is that a sustainable financial system is a system that is aligned with the needs of the real economy. So many of the problems that we face now are due to a misalignment between the financial system and the needs of society. And focusing in on inclusion is a way of focusing in on the needs of the real economy and increasing that alignment. And the third introductory thing I'll say is that there are many approaches to so-called greening or making more sustainable the financial system. A lot of them are focused on providing tools so that investors can orient more of their investments to activities that are compatible with sustainable development. And of course, that is something that should happen and should increase. Our view, however, is that the financial system will never align with sustainable development unless we take a close look at the rules that govern financial and capital markets and ensure that those rules, at the very least, don't provide a disincentive to moving towards greener forms of finance, and ideally that they should provide incentives that makes the greener forms of finance more attractive. So over a period of years from 2014, and we can go on to the next slide now, the UNEP Inquiry has focused on a range of approaches, all aimed at looking at how we might affect, influence, reform the rules governing financial and capital markets so that they align better with sustainable development. This has included a great deal of national actions, and this is here just an illustration of them. What we've worked with Kenya on making sure that the mobile banking serves the transition to sustainable finance. We've worked with China on its green financial strategy. We've also worked on a series of market innovations, and these include establishing a sustainable digital finance alliance to look at the potential for digital finance not only to serve financial inclusion, but to speed up the availability of sustainable solutions. The Financial Centers for Sustainability, the one below there on the logo, is an alliance of 30 major financial centers all around the world, and it includes not only sort of London, Paris, New York, Shanghai, and Tokyo, but also just about half of the membership from developing and emerging economies. So it is an alliance of these centers where all of these different streams of sustainable finance come together. We've worked through existing mechanisms such as the G20 or the G7, and with the Sustainable Insurance Forum and the Network for Greening of the Financial System, in order to ensure that that sustainable finance has high-level political acceptability, and that it is not simply seen as something that is a niche operation. And we have, and I'll come back to this, worked with a number of tools that enable countries, financial centers, financial sector actors to understand how best they might contribute to sustainable finance transition. And we have put out yearly reports summarizing our findings and what we have learned from the experience around the world. Next slide. So as I said, I'll just use one illustration of it. When China chaired the G20 in 2016, they included a sustainable finance study group. And this study group was not in the usual Sherpa stream of the G20, but it was in the finance ministers stream. It was in the leaders summit. And the important thing about this was not the insights that they yielded on sustainable finance. It was a mark of the political acceptability at the very highest levels of the notion of sustainable finance. It is something that is surging, it's something that's building. We called it in our first report a quiet revolution, because gathering evidence from around the world suggested that this is a topic that's going through a massive surge. And at the end, I'll talk about how COVID-19 might accelerate that surge further. Next slide, please. Yeah. We also, of course, have been part of and observing and cooperating with a massive organization of interests around sustainable finance. This little mapping you see on the right of the slide just shows not only the number of initiatives and networks that are emerging in this field, but more especially how much they overlap and interact. We have seen sustainable finance initiatives simply exploding, and we have seen every part of the financial and capital markets getting organized within their own sectors, within their own asset classes, to accelerate the transition to the sustainable finance. So we have, and we include AFI in this, identified 9 global networks whose purpose is to advance fair and sustainable financial systems around the world that operate globally or near globally. And these cover the sectors. Of course, there's the principles for responsible investment that gathers investors, including pension funds and institutional investors, and works with them to implement sustainable finance solutions. You have the principles for sustainable insurance, which works with the insurance companies, but also the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which gathers together the insurance regulators around the world to look at what might be done to favor this transition in the insurance industry. You have the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. You have the Sustainable Banking Network. So the conclusion is that every sector has now gotten organized, and there's now an enormous potential for those sectors to begin working together, perhaps through the financial centers, in ways that allows each one to leverage the work and impact of the others. Next, please. And so I'd like to illustrate our work in a very practical way by using the rest of the presentation, or most of it, to actually talk about tools that we have developed for the purposes of assisting our membership, the countries, the financial centers, and the other actors in the financial and capital markets to understand how practically they might benefit from the best practice developed in other countries. And this is something that AFI does very well also, but also to be inspired by the success that's being achieved in many of these places with these innovative solutions. So we've put together what we call the Policy and Regulatory Measures Database. In other words, we've tried to collect and classify all of the policy developments, all the regulatory measures taken by countries around the world that relate to the aim of accelerating the the sustainable finance and relating that finance to the SDG challenge. And you can see that there are growing lines in virtually every part of the world. In developed economies, you see a massive development of policies and measures around finance and around the related field of securities, but a very sharp rise in systemic measures that are being taken. In the developing and emerging economies, quite naturally, you see a great deal of development in the field of banking, but caught up now by securities and rapidly growing also in system terms. What's lower, understandably, are the number of measures in investment, simply because most of the investment policies and decisions are taken in the countries from which investment originates. But you're seeing a very rapid growth, and it's very important to be able to access these. Next slide, please. So what you look at, we have done this by asset class, but we've also done it by form of policy development or form of intervention. And again, the emerging countries, there's a strong focus on reallocation, on finance supporting social justice, but a great deal also developing in the field of responsibility and reporting, namely those measures that enable you to understand better what's happening in the financial system so that you can encourage and develop it. In the developed countries, a very sharp surge in responsibility, things like responsible investment, environmental, social, and governance measures taken by corporations, but also in the field of reporting, where there's a great deal more transparency now available to those interested in following the field. And so we have looked at over 30 countries and helped 30 countries to try and identify these, put them into a kind of category, and make them available through what we hope will be a very open source database. Next, please. We have used this to develop another tool, which we call the diagnostic toolkit. In other words, if a country or even a financial center decides that they wish to look at all the different range of policies and measures and regulatory developments and fintech solutions that are available, and apply them in a strategic way to their own environment, what is the best practice available out there? And we have looked at and worked with and assisted a number of strategic developments around this, which we generally call sustainable finance roadmaps. We worked, for example, with Nigeria in developing Nigeria's own sustainable finance roadmap. And that involved looking at what each of the players in the financial and capital markets was doing, and looking at how their actions could influence and encourage the others, so that you had a system-wide movement in the direction of sustainable finance. And there's a strong and growing demand, not only in the developing and emerging economies, but also now in the developed economies to do this. And as you know, the European Union has done something very similar. Next slide. So the diagnostic toolkit, which again is an open source facility asset, provides a step-by-step guide to those that are trying to develop sustainable finance transition measures, by both taking a diagnostic approach, trying to understand better the current operations of the markets and how they might best be influenced, but also as a planning tool that identifies where, for example, training and capacity building might be most effective. We've now operated this in over 30 countries, so there's a fair amount of experience built into that toolkit, and it rests on a lot of good examples. Next, please. And so if you look at the diagnostic toolkit, and as I said, it's available on our website. We'd be happy to circulate it to the membership of AFI. Yeah, sorry, there was a background noise there. It starts by trying to understand and build a narrative around the potential for sustainable finance approaches to meet the needs of society in a way that the current financial system does not. It works through definitions. It works through trying to understand what are the sustainable finance needs of a country, for example, in meeting their obligations under the climate change agreements or the biodiversity convention. It looks at the current financial flows and identifies where the investment gaps are most significant. But it also tries to understand why these flows aren't working more smoothly. What are the barriers? What are the obstacles? Do they relate to existing policies? Do they relate to institutional misalignment? Do they relate to lack of capacity or lack of experience in this area? It tries to bring in the best of international experience, and this is from around the world. And the examples that Johanna gave of some of the developments you're looking at shows that there's a huge amount of innovation taking place in the developing and emerging economies. And in fact, some of it is more innovative and more exciting than what you're seeing in the European Union or other areas. It then tries to map the national financial system to understand where are the centers, who are the actors, where is their strength, where is their weakness, and then where could one rely on identifying drivers of the sustainable finance transition. It offers a progress stock taking of what's happened so far, and then a sort of list of potential ideas, innovations that the country or financial center might consider. So it's a very structured way for those who say, yes, we must move through this transition to more sustainable forms of finance, more inclusive forms of finance, of what they might do, in what sequence, with what actors, and which hold the most promise for future development. Next, please. Now, I was asking this topic, of course, to relate these green finance developments to the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, when I talk about sustainable finance, sustainable is in a sense defined by the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals that are included in that agenda, because this is the globally accepted set of priorities that has been adopted in 2015 to be implemented by 2030, and that all countries around the world are working to seek to implement. So when we talk about what do we do with the sustainable finance, the answer is clearly we apply it to implementing the SDGs to the greatest extent possible. But it is important to understand how finance relates to SDG development. Of course, in a general way, it relates to everything because it underpins all the developments, all the capacity, all government programs, and all civil society programs. But if you talk about how the finance sector interacts with the Sustainable Development Goals, there's first the observation that we need a considerable amount of finance to fill the gaps that exist in developing countries, to enable them to fulfill what they have undertaken to do in their pledges in 2015. But it also is interesting to see how the two ways in which finance relates to the SDGs. One on the left of the graph is mobilizing finance. So it's addressing that gap and showing that if we're able to secure greater financial flows into the priorities of SDG implementation, then there's a great deal more we can do. It relates to financial inclusion, that first column there. It relates to capital for sustainable infrastructure, and it relates to financing innovation. But none of that's going to happen completely unless we are able to mainstream sustainability in the existing financial system and in existing financial practices. And this has to do with three different areas. One is improving market integrity. The third is taking a fresh and broader approach to the notion of risk and resilience, ensuring that environmental risk or social risk is not simply a reason for eliminating investments, but that it's built into the investment model. And finally, building on the notions of responsibility of the finance sector to serve public policy goals and to advance those, particularly those that have been adopted globally by the countries of the world. Next slide, please. So I'd like to end with simply some of the key lessons of the last 6 years of work in the inquiry, or 5.5 years. What we think we have been able to do is to really change the narrative, to show that that sustainable finance is not a boutique operation, but in fact, it needs to replace traditional approaches to finance if the world has a chance of meeting its climate change challenges and its other public policy goals. We have tried to avoid telling countries or financial actors what they should do, but instead to support the innovation that they're already showing and to apply best practice from around the world. We have not tried to sort of pick winners and say this is the answer to this thing, and we haven't tried to build this into major programs that's for the other actors, for the countries, for the financial centers to do themselves. We realize we haven't adequately covered the whole range of financial actors. We have not been able to focus the way we would have liked to on small island or fragile states, and there are issues around market integrity that we didn't come to. But we think that we have enabled sustainable finance to be something that everybody, in a sense, is behind. Everybody thinks is a valid goal, and to demonstrate that this is not a matter for environment ministries. This is not a matter for responsible investors. It's actually a challenge for the entire market, for the entire financial system, public sector and private sector. And finally, I think that UNEP, although it focuses on the environment through its mandate, has provided a platform on which many different interests can come in. UNEP has never said the environment is the priority, this is what must be done, but has tried to show how the environment is a factor in everything else that we do. And I think this is a good example of showing how it will be developed in the future. So I just want to end with a few words on the COVID crisis. I know you've had a separate webinar on it, but I think that the COVID crisis, as Johanna said, it's absolutely essential now that we focus on saving lives and on meeting the economic needs of those who are most affected by it. But there will come a time when we start designing recovery and rebuilding post-pandemic. I think this is an excellent opportunity to think of ways in which that recovery might be developed so that it addresses our climate change goals and our biodiversity goals and the SDGs. And I think that if we don't do that, what we will find is that the COVID crisis has been nothing more than a dress rehearsal for an even greater shock to our system if climate change plays through in the ways that we hope it will not, or biodiversity loss leads to real crashes in the ecosystems that support us. So just to leave you with one idea, and that is that developing and emerging countries will go into debt inevitably. And the way in which they can come out of that debt offers opportunities for real innovation. For example, accelerated debt relief to those countries that implement the SDGs or meet their climate change goals. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So let me open the floor for all the questions that you have. And in case that you have any question, I really encourage you to use the question and answer platform in case that you want to write it. Otherwise, please just raise your hand, and then we can open or be unmuted to can talk. Is there any question, any suggestion, something that you would like to contribute?
If I may, Laura?
Yes, please.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you very much for this informative presentation. We really appreciate all the knowledge shared. I have a thought that I would like to share with all of you, that it is a very wide subject, full of initiatives, as mentioned by panelists. But we need to know the recommendation for our case, like regulators and central banks. What's the steps that should be taken in order to be focused in certain approach? Is it like we need to build capacity with our banking sectors first? Because I can tell you from our experience in Egypt, the knowledge is not there yet for the commercial banks. So is it the first step is to creating and put the knowledge together and share it with all the banking sector, and then come up with a soft approach about how to implement a sustainable finance approach? Or is it, because there is also a big mixture between the sustainable finance and the social corporate responsibility? This is always, I get this mixed concept when I talk to commercial banks. So we need kind of a recommendation what first steps needs to be taken by central banks and regulators who didn't yet start their journey. Thank you.
Would you like me to answer questions as they come, or do you want to collect a few? I'm asking Johanna or Laura.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Walid, for that reflection. I think there's also one
Merci
question.
beaucoup, Walid, pour votre question. Une autre question pour Verónica.
Por Verónica y después, Mark, usted puede responder.
Hi, Johanna. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Yeah. My question has something to do with what is going on, like the COVID-19 outbreak. My question is more on the implementation of sustainable, inclusive green finance initiatives. Because following the outbreak of COVID-19, my question is, what's your sense of what's going to happen to the initiatives of most countries who have started with their inclusive green finance initiatives? Do you have a sense if these initiatives will have to be pushed back? The reason why I'm asking this question is because the sustainable finance framework of the BSP was approved by the board 2 weeks ago. But because of the outbreak of COVID-19, we are pretty limited in rolling this out, because the focus now is more on measures that would directly address COVID-19 impacts.
Yes, thank you so much, Veronica, for that question and reflection. If I can give over to Mark first to answer these two questions, and then I'll share my thoughts.
Thank you, Johanna. I'll try and be brief because I see that others are also asking for the floor. To Walid's question, I think that it's a mistake to think that the banking sector represents the financial system, and that at the policy level and the regulatory level, there's an enormous amount that needs to be done. The first thing I would say would be that if you're not yet members, you should join the Network for the Greening of Financial System, because it is the network that gathers together the central banks and financial regulators working at that.
Reguladores.
But the other thing I would say is that
Otras cosas yo quiero decir.
Nous avons une tendance à penser de la progression du développement.
niche or boutique market, and then gradually becoming mainstreamed. I don't think that is what is happening. I think that what we're seeing is that sustainable finance is establishing itself as a new stream that will replace mainstream finance. And so it's not a question of saying, well, let's build some green criteria or some inclusivity criteria into the operations of our financial actors. We actually need to look at how the system can best contribute. And when it comes to central banks, there's a great deal that banks can do. using monetary policy instruments. They can build on best practice that's now readily available through NGFS. They are central to the design of stimulus packages and quantitative easing, and they are open to the idea that quantitative easing should actually turn into a form of green easing. I think if we get stuck at CSR, we get stuck at a past generation of approaches. This is much more systemic. It involves every part of the community. And to the second question, what we're seeing as a result of COVID, at least in the private sector, is that banks and corporations are expanding their sustainability teams. They
de
are
durabilité. Et les plus intelligents parmi
entre todos.
system shift, and they want to come. If they want to come out of it successfully, they need to come out of it capable of addressing sustainable finance solutions to our current problem. There will be no question about it when we start coming out of the crisis, an attempt by powerful players in the system to go back to where we were before. But I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's desirable, and I don't think there'll be a real tolerance of it. So there's a real scope for innovation. We all want robust economies, but we want robust economies that serve public policy purposes and are inclusive. So I would say there may be an immediate delay in some measures, particularly if they require budgetary allocation, but I think that the system will not go back to what it was before.
Thank you very much. So we have one question in our platform from Yurandi Pansel. Thank you very much. And they say, in Angola, we are starting work with green finance, and I want to know what is better way to introduce this theme in the country with financial institutions, supervisors, and regulators, and in the government. Do you have any? Could you please share this?
My response to that would be to take a systematic approach to it. And so the two tools that I illustrated, one, the sort of diagnostic toolkit, is a very systematic way of looking at the present financial system, at where it is incomplete or insufficient, and looking at the different measures that might be possible to put into place. If you follow the sort of national road mapping approach that is suggested in that diagnostic toolkit, it will identify the key areas where Angola actually has a great deal of promise in terms of developing sustainable finance approaches, where some of the obstacles lie and where reforms might be considered, and where institutions may have to amend their mandates or build strength and capacity to address a new set of challenges. So I think that's the systematic approach that I would recommend. In doing that, of course, you can draw on the growing database of policies and measures that have been implemented in other parts of the world, and you may find within those things that you think apply to the Angolan situation and that could be imported, adapted, developed further, and implemented in your own national context.
Thank you very much. Johanna, do you would like to contribute with something?
Just a quick add-on to what Mark was saying. I think it's also quite crucial to have the national level coordination, because when we talk about green finance or inclusive green finance, we're also moving in so to say, between different traditional policy areas. So just to bring all relevant stakeholders in the room and to have a complete overview also, for example, what's happening on the climate and environmental side, in order to be able to design responses that are really, one, making sure that there are no overlaps or reinventing the wheel, but two, also making sure that all the stakeholders, there's a buy-in and there's an understanding of where to move collectively. And that's, of course, a lot easier said than done. But I think one emerging examples is the work that has been done in Bhutan, where RMA Bhutan has been leading on a national level the dialogue around green finance, and more than happy to connect you to them as well if you want to hear concrete pointers of what they have been doing. Then just secondly, on the question from Veronica, I think it's quite clear that things are going to slow down in the weeks and months to come, unfortunately. We also saw that, for example, the COP26, the climate negotiations were postponed with 1 year. So definitely there will be some slowdown of the initial development of climate policies and green finance policies. But indeed, I must agree with what Mark is saying. There will be something new emerging out of this. And it's quite important, I think, that at this stage there is a clear view of how the green elements can be an integral or kind of a very essential part of the new systems that will be put in place. And also, I think, just to learn from this policy area, we also have a number of post-disaster reconstruction recovery policies that are presented in the landscape. And of course, there's a difference between a natural disaster and a global pandemic, but some of the policies and instruments used could be used also in this kind of a situation. So there's, in that sense, also overlap in the nature of the crisis that we're seeing.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else has another question? Okay, so let me wrap up this session. Just saying that during this wonderful presentation, we reviewed the climate risk-related risks. That means that extreme weather events implies biodiversity loss, natural disasters, involuntary migration, and at the end, social and economic instability. We learn about transition and physical risk, and we learn about some IGF policies coming from AFI members institutions categorized under the AFI 4P framework, including promotion, provision, protection, and prevention policies. We also heard about how Inquiry is working to promote international cooperation on green and sustainable finance policy and regulation that have multiplied in recent years. Mark presented us the diagnostic toolkit that has already been tested, and how finance has key impacts on all sustainable development goals and is key for their success. So I just have to say at the end that thank you very much for your participation.